Y'all, when I walked into that Los Angeles Police Department station on Wilshire Boulevard wearing my brand new uniform at 68 years old, every single officer in that building stopped what they were doing and stared at me like I was some kind of circus act. And
Honey, I knew right then that I was going to have to prove myself in ways I never imagined when I decided to become the oldest rookie cop in LAPD history. My name is Beverly, and I've been living in Los Angeles since 1979, back when my husband Frank was still alive and working construction on some of the biggest buildings downtown. We raised our 3 kids, Tommy, Sarah, and little Michael, in a small house in Boyle Heights, and I spent 43 years working as a school cafeteria manager, serving lunch to thousands of children who called me Miss Beverly, and sometimes just plain old Grandma Bev. But sweetie, after Frank passed 2 years ago and my kids moved away to chase their fancy careers, I found myself sitting in that empty house every day, watching the neighborhood change, watching crime creep closer to my front door, and feeling more useless than I'd ever felt in my entire life. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in March when I was walking to the corner market on First Street, the same walk I've been taking for 37 years, when some punk kid no older than my grandson tried to snatch my purse right there in broad daylight. Now, honey, before I tell you what happened next, and believe me, this part is going to absolutely shock you. If you're loving this story, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell. You know I get so excited when I see y'all in the comments. Speaking of which, what state are you calling home right now? Drop it down below. And tell me honestly, have you ever felt like the world was leaving you behind, like you didn't matter anymore? Because your stories help me know I'm not alone in this crazy world. Now let me tell you what happened when that boy grabbed my purse, because what I did next surprised everyone, including me. That kid thought he was dealing with some helpless old lady, but what he didn't know was that Mrs. Beverly had been breaking up cafeteria fights for 4 decades, dealing with teenagers who thought they were tougher than a 60-something woman with a hairnet and an attitude. When he yanked on my purse strap, I didn't scream or fall down like he expected. Instead, I grabbed that boy's wrist with one hand and his ear with the other, and I marched him right back to where he came from, like he was a misbehaving student heading to the principal's office. "Young man," I said in my best cafeteria voice, the one that could silence a room full of hungry teenagers, "you going to apologize for trying to steal from your elder, and then you're going to explain to me why you think this is acceptable behavior." The look on his face was pure confusion, sweetie, like he couldn't process what was happening to him. Here was this old lady treating him like a child instead of cowering in fear, and he didn't know how to respond. By the time the police arrived, because Mrs. Chen from the flower shop had called 911, I had that boy sitting on the curb telling me about his problems at home, his mom working 3 jobs, his little sister needing school supplies they couldn't afford. The 2 officers who responded, Officer Martinez and Officer Johnson, looked at me like I was some kind of magician who turned a robbery into a counseling session. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said, his voice full of admiration and confusion, "how did you get him to calm down? We've been chasing this kid for weeks, and usually these situations end very differently." That's when something clicked in my brain, y'all. I looked at these 2 young officers, probably the same age as my own children, and I realized they were trying to police a community they didn't really understand. They saw troublemakers where I saw hungry kids, threats where I saw children acting out because nobody was paying attention to them at home. "Officer, honey," I said, still keeping one eye on the boy who was now crying softly beside me, "these kids don't need more punishment. They need someone who understands that bad behavior usually comes from bad situations, not bad hearts." Officer Johnson, a nice young woman who reminded me of my Sarah, looked at me with something that might have been hope. Mrs. Beverly Gonzalez," I said, extending my hand like I was meeting new parents at school orientation, "and I've been dealing with troubled children for longer than you've been alive, sweetie." That's when Officer Martinez said something that would change my life forever. "Mrs. Gonzalez, have you ever considered joining the force? The LAPD has a community outreach program, and we could use someone with your skiggles." I laughed so hard I nearly snorted, honey. "Officer, I'm 68 years old. I think your police academy might be looking for someone a little younger and a lot more athletic." But Officer Johnson was nodding enthusiastically. "Actually, ma'am, there's no upper age limit for police officers in California. If you can pass the physical and mental requirements, they have to let you try." That night, I sat in my empty house, the same house where Frank and I had raised our children, where we'd celebrated birthdays and anniversaries and graduations, and I thought about what those officers had said. My kids called me once a week, if I was lucky, usually rushing through conversations about their busy lives, their important jobs, their social events. Tommy was a lawyer in San Francisco, too busy to visit. Sarah was a marketing executive in Seattle, always traveling for work. Michael was a computer programmer in Austin, living his best life as a bachelor with no time for his old mother's loneliness. None of them needed me anymore, and I'd been feeling like a burden whenever I called, like I was interrupting their real lives with my stories about the neighborhood and my doctor's appointments and my memories of their father. But those officers had looked at me like I had something valuable to offer, like my 43 years of managing children and solving problems might actually be useful in the world. I spent the next 3 weeks researching what it would take to become a police officer in Los Angeles, the physical requirements, the training academy, the background checks, the psychological evaluations. Every website I visited, every article I read seemed to assume that police recruits were young, fit, fresh out of college with their whole careers ahead of them. There were no pictures of 68-year-old grandmas in police uniforms, no success stories about senior citizens starting new careers in law enforcement. But you know what, y'all? The more people tried to convince me it was impossible, the more determined I became. When I called the LAPD recruiting office and told them I was interested in applying, the young man who answered the phone actually asked me if I was calling on behalf of my grandson. "No, honey," I said, letting a little bit of my cafeteria authority creep into my voice. "I'm calling for myself, Beverly Gonzalez, born 1955, ready to serve and protect the city of Los Angeles." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long I thought he'd hung up on me. Finally, he said, "Ma'am, are you sure you have the right number? This is the police recruitment line." "I'm sure, sweetie. When can I schedule my appointment?" The application process was like nothing I'd ever experienced. And honey, I'd filled out plenty of paperwork in my time. School employment forms, insurance claims, mortgage applications, medical forms after Frank's diagnosis. But police applications wanted to know everything about my entire life. Every job I'd ever held, every place I'd ever lived, every person who could vouch for my character. When I listed my 43 years as a cafeteria manager, I could almost hear the recruiting officers laughing. Food service wasn't exactly the background they were expecting from a potential police officer. But I also listed my volunteer work with the church youth group, my experience mediating parent-teacher conferences, my role as the unofficial neighborhood watch coordinator for our block, and my certifications in first aid and CPR that I'd maintained for decades. The physical fitness test was scheduled for a Thursday morning at the police academy in Elysian Park. And sweetie, walking onto that campus filled with young, athletic recruits was like stepping into a different world. Everyone else was in their 20s and 30s, wearing expensive workout gear, stretching and doing push-ups like they were preparing for the Olympics. Then there was me, 68-year-old Beverly, wearing Frank's old gym shorts and a t-shirt from my grandson's high school graduation. The test consisted of a timed run, push-ups, sit-ups, and an obstacle course that included climbing over walls and crawling under barriers. The other recruits kept glancing at me with mixtures of confusion, pity, and barely concealed amusement. One young man, probably Tommy's age, actually approached me before the test started. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place? The Citizens Police Academy meets on weekends." I looked him up and down, this boy who was young enough to be my grandson, and I smiled my sweetest smile. "Honey, I've been running after misbehaving children for 4 decades. I think I can handle whatever they throw at me today." The run was first, and I'll admit, sweetie, it wasn't pretty. While the young recruits sprinted ahead like gazelles, I maintained a steady pace that got me across the finish line within the required time limit, but just barely. I could hear some of the instructors talking among themselves, wondering what kind of joke this was, whether someone had put me up to this as a prank. The push-ups were where things got interesting. See, when you've spent 40 years lifting heavy trays of food, moving cafeteria tables, and wrestling with industrial kitchen equipment, you develop a different kind of strength than these gym rats who focused on looking good in mirrors. I knocked out the required number of push-ups with time to spare, and I noticed the conversation among the instructors getting quieter, more serious. By the time we got to the obstacle course, the atmosphere had completely changed. The other recruits were no longer snickering or whispering about the crazy old lady. They were watching me with something that might have been respect, or at least curiosity about how far I could actually go. The obstacle course was designed to simulate real police scenarios, climbing over fences, crawling through tight spaces, navigating around barriers while carrying equipment. Every obstacle reminded me of something from my years managing a school cafeteria, climbing onto counters to reach high shelves, crawling under tables to clean spills, maneuvering heavy equipment through tight spaces in the kitchen. When I finished the course within the required time limit, the supervising officer, Sergeant Williams, looked at his stopwatch like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The other recruits were staring at me with expressions ranging from amazement to embarrassment that a grandmother had outperformed some of them. "Sergeant Gonzalez," Sergeant Williams said, approaching me with something that looked like newfound respect. "That was impressive. How long did you say you worked in food service?" 43 years, honey. And let me tell you, managing lunch for 800 kids every day is its own kind of obstacle course. The psychological evaluation was next, and this is where I expected to struggle. I'd never been to therapy, never had to explain my mental health to strangers, never been asked to analyze my motivations for wanting such a dramatic career change. The police psychologist, Dr. Rebecca Chen, was a woman about my Sarah's age, with kind eyes and a gentle way of asking probing questions. "Miss Gonzalez, what makes you think you'd be a good police officer at this stage of your life?" I thought about that question for a long moment, remembering all the situations I'd handled over the years. Kids having panic attacks in the lunch line, teenagers dealing with abuse at home, parents struggling with poverty and trying to maintain dignity while applying for free lunch programs for their children. "Dr. Honey, I've spent 40 years being the person kids came to when they were hungry, scared, or in trouble. I've learned to see past the anger and defiance to the hurt underneath. I've learned that most people acting out are really just asking for help in the only way they know how." Dr. Chen made notes while I talked, nodding occasionally, asking follow-up questions about specific situations I'd handled, how I resolved conflicts, how I'd earned the trust of children who didn't trust adults. "And you think those skills would transfer to police work?" "I think police work and school work aren't that different, sweetie. Both involve dealing with people who don't want to follow rules, people who are acting out because of problems at home, people who need someone to listen to them before trying to fix them." 6 weeks later, I got the call that would change everything. I was accepted into the LAPD Training Academy, the oldest recruit in the academy's history. And honey, when I hung up that phone, I cried like a baby. Not sad tears, but tears of pure excitement and terror and pride all mixed together. The police academy was 24 weeks of the most intense education I'd ever experienced. And that includes the time I went back to school to get my food service management certification while working full-time and raising 3 teenagers. We learned law, criminal procedure, firearms training, defensive tactics, emergency vehicle operation, and community policing strategies. My classmates were all young enough to be my children, and at first they treated me like a mascot or a curiosity, the grandmother who had somehow stumbled into their world. But as the weeks passed and I consistently scored in the top tier on written exams, held my own in physical training, and demonstrated skills they didn't have, their attitude towards me began to change. The firearms training was where I surprised everyone, including myself. I'd never held a gun before the academy, never had any interest in weapons, but it turned out that the steady hands I developed from 40 years of precise food preparation and the calm focus I'd learned from managing cafeteria chaos translated perfectly to marksmanship. While some of my younger classmates struggled with accuracy under pressure, I found the shooting range almost meditative. Mrs. G, one of my classmates, David Rodriguez, said after watching me put every shot in the center ring during a particularly stressful qualification test, "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" I didn't, honey. But when you've spent 40 years slicing vegetables and decorating cakes under pressure, keeping your hands steady becomes second nature.
The defensive tactics training was more challenging, physically demanding in ways that food service had never been. Learning to restrain suspects, defend against attacks, and use physical force appropriately required developing muscles and reflexes I'd never needed before. But my instructors quickly realized that my approach to physical confrontation was different from my classmates. Where the young recruits relied on strength and speed, I used patience and psychology. In role-playing exercises where we practiced dealing with difficult suspects, I consistently talked my way out of situations that the others resolved with force. Not because I was weak or unable to use force, but because I understood that most people acting aggressively were really scared, confused, or desperate. Gonzalez, Instructor Martinez said after watching me successfully de-escalate a particularly volatile scenario, "You've got something these kids don't have: experience with human nature." Graduation day from the police academy was one of the proudest moments of my life, right up there with my children's graduations and my wedding day with Frank. My kids flew in for the ceremony: Tommy from San Francisco, Sarah from Seattle, and Michael from Austin. And for the first time in years, I could see genuine pride in their eyes instead of the worried concern they'd been showing since Frank died. "Mom," Sarah said after the ceremony, tears streaming down her face, "I can't believe you actually did this. You're the most badass grandmother in America." Tommy, my lawyer son, who'd always been the most practical and cautious of my children, shook his head in amazement. "I have to admit, when you first told me about this crazy idea, I thought you were having some kind of midlife crisis. But watching you up there today, in that uniform, with those other officers treating you like a colleague, I've never been more proud to be your son." Even Michael, my baby, who'd always been too cool to show much emotion, was openly crying. "Mom, you're like a superhero. My friends are going to freak out when they hear my grandmother is a cop." My first assignment was to the Rampart Division, covering some of the neighborhoods I'd lived in or near my entire adult life. The captain, Captain Jennifer Morrison, was a woman in her 40s who'd worked her way up through the ranks and had a reputation for being tough but fair. "Officer Gonzalez," she said during my first briefing, "I'm going to be honest with you. When I heard we're getting a 68-year-old rookie, I had concerns. This division sees a lot of action, deals with some serious crime, and I need to know that every officer on my team can handle whatever comes their way." "Captain, honey," I replied, "I understand your concerns, but I've been living in this community for 44 years, and I know these streets, these families, these problems better than officers who are just passing through on their way to better assignments." She studied me for a long moment, probably trying to figure out if my confidence was justified or if I was in for a rude awakening. "We'll see, Gonzalez. Your first partner is going to be Officer Maria Santos. She's been on the force for 8 years, knows the area well, and has experience training new officers. Officer Santos was a Latina woman, about Tommy's age, with the kind of no-nonsense attitude I recognized from the more experienced teachers I'd worked with over the years. She looked at me with frank skepticism during our first meeting. "Look, Mrs. Gonzalez," she said as we sat in our patrol car before our first shift together, "I don't know what kind of strings you pulled to get this job, but out here, age and experience don't matter if you can't keep up. If you put me or anyone else in danger because you can't handle the physical demands of this job, we're going to have problems." I appreciated her directness, sweetie. It reminded me of the way the best teachers spoke, honest, challenging, but not mean-spirited. "Officer Santos, I understand your concerns, and I want you to know that I would never put my partner at risk. If there comes a time when I can't do this job safely, I'll be the first to turn in my badge." Our first call was a domestic disturbance on 6th Street, the kind of situation that could go bad quickly depending on how the officers approached it. A neighbor had called about screaming and crashing sounds coming from an apartment where a young couple lived with their 2 small children. Officer Santos briefed me as we walked up to the apartment building. Domestic calls are unpredictable, could be nothing, could be dangerous. We go in calm, assess the situation, de-escalate if possible, but be ready for anything. When the apartment door opened, we were met by a young woman, maybe 25, with tear-streaked makeup and a crying baby in her arms. Behind her, I could hear a man's voice shouting in Spanish, and another child, probably a toddler, was wailing. Officer Santos began the standard questioning, asking if everyone was safe, if anyone needed medical attention, what had happened to prompt the call. The young woman, clearly overwhelmed and scared, kept looking back toward the apartment like she was afraid of what her boyfriend might do if she said the wrong thing. That's when my 40 years of dealing with scared children kicked in, y'all. I stepped forward, not as a police officer, but as someone who understood what it felt like to be overwhelmed by circumstances beyond your control. "Mija," I said softly, using the Spanish endearment I'd heard so many times from parents in my school. "What's the baby's name?" The question seemed to surprise her out of her fear spiral. "Isabella," she whispered. "Isabella is beautiful," I said, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. "And how old is your other little one?" "Carlos is 2, and I could see her shoulders relaxing slightly as we talked about her children instead of whatever crisis had brought the police to her door. Officer Santos was watching this interaction with growing amazement as I gradually got the whole story. The young father, Roberto, had lost his job at a restaurant that morning. He'd come home angry and scared about how they would pay rent, buy groceries, take care of the children. The argument had escalated, things had been thrown, neighbors had called the police. "But he didn't hit you?" I asked gently. No, Roberto would never hurt me or the children. He's just scared. We're both scared." Officer Santos was preparing to follow standard protocol, separate the couple, take statements, determined if any laws had been broken, possibly make an arrest. But I could see that what we had here wasn't a criminal situation. It was a family in crisis who needed help, not punishment. "Officer Santos," I said quietly, "could I try something?" She looked at me skeptically but nodded. 5 minutes. I asked the young woman, whose name was Carmen, if I could speak with Roberto. She hesitated, then called to him in Spanish. A young man emerged from the back of the apartment, probably no older than my own Michael, with the kind of defeated posture I recognized from parents who'd lost jobs and didn't know how they would feed their children. "Roberto," I said in my limited but heartfelt Spanish, "soy abuela también." I am a grandmother too. Something in his face shifted when I said those words, sweetie. Here was this police officer, this symbol of authority that he probably expected to arrest him or judge him, telling him that she understood what it meant to worry about children. I spent the next 20 minutes talking with Roberto and Carmen, not as a police officer investigating a crime, but as someone who'd seen families struggle, who'd watched good people make bad choices when they were desperate and scared. I learned that Roberto had been working at the same restaurant for 3 years, that he'd never been in trouble with the law, that both he and Carmen were trying to finish their GED classes while working and raising 2 babies. "Officer Gonzalez," Roberto said at one point, his voice breaking with emotion, "I don't know what to do. Without this job, we can't pay rent. We can't buy food for the children. I feel like I'm failing my family." That's when I did something that probably wasn't in any police manual, y'all. I gave Roberto the phone number for the restaurant where my friend's son worked as a manager, a place I knew was hiring kitchen staff. I told Carmen about the WIC program and the food banks in the area, resources I'd connected school families with for decades. I explained the process for applying for emergency rental assistance through the county. By the time Officer Santos and I left that apartment, Roberto had a job interview scheduled for the next morning. Carmen had information about childcare assistance while she finished her education, and their children were playing quietly instead of crying in fear. Officer Santos said as we walked back to our patrol car, "What the hell was that?" That, honey, was community policing. Sometimes the best way to prevent crime is to address the problems that lead people to make desperate choices. That's not how we usually handle domestic disturbance calls. Maybe that's why so many of them turn into repeat calls, sweetie. Officer Santos was quiet for the rest of our shift, but I could see her processing what she'd witnessed, thinking about different approaches to the situations we encountered. Over the following weeks, as we responded to more calls together, she began to see how my approach to policing was different from what she'd been trained to do. Where other officers saw criminals, I saw people having the worst days of their lives. Where others saw problems that needed to be contained or punished, I saw situations that could be resolved with the right combination of authority, compassion, and practical resources. 3 months into my career as a police officer, we got called to a situation that would test everything I'd learned and everything I believed about community policing. A group of teenagers had been gathering in Hollenbeck Park after school, and business owners were complaining that the kids were being loud, intimidating customers, and generally causing problems. When Officer Santos and I arrived at the park, we found about 15 kids, ranging in age from maybe 12 to 17, just hanging out near the basketball courts. They weren't doing anything obviously illegal, but I could see why the business owners were concerned. Some of the older boys had the kind of defensive postures that suggested they'd had negative encounters with police before, and the group dynamic had that edge that I recognized from school situations that could escalate quickly if handled wrong. "Standard procedure," Officer Santos said as we got out of the car, "is to disperse the group, take names, run checks for warrants, maybe cite anyone who's truant from school." But as I looked at those kids, I saw something Officer Santos might have missed. These weren't gang members or criminals in training. These were bored teenagers with nowhere else to go. No structured activities, no adults paying attention to them in positive ways. They reminded me of the kids who used to linger in the cafeteria after lunch, not because they were causing trouble, but because they dreaded going back to empty classrooms or empty homes. "Officer Santos, what if we tried something different?" She looked at me with that expression I'd come to recognize, half curiosity, half concern that I was about to do something that would get us both in trouble. "What do you have in mind?" Instead of approaching the group with authority and demands, I walked up to them like I was greeting students in my cafeteria. "Hey y'all, how's everyone doing today?" The kids looked at me with the same confusion I'd seen in that young purse snatcher months ago. Here was a police officer, but she was talking to them like a person, not like a threat or an authority figure trying to move them along. "We're not doing nothing wrong," one of the older boys said defensively. "I didn't say you were, honey. I was just wondering why y'all choose to hang out here instead of somewhere with better facilities. This park doesn't have much to offer teenagers." That simple question opened up a conversation that lasted over an hour, sweetie. These kids told Officer Santos and I about their lives. Parents working multiple jobs, siblings they had to watch after school, homework they couldn't get help with, dreams they had for their futures, but no idea how to achieve them. One girl, named Maria, maybe 14, told us she wanted to be a veterinarian but was failing biology because she couldn't understand the textbook and there was no one at home who could help her. A boy named Carlos, about 16, was interested in automotive repair but said his school didn't have a shop class and he couldn't afford the community college courses. "What if," I said, looking around at all these bright, eager faces, "we could figure out ways to connect y'all with people who could help with some of these problems?" Officer Santos was watching this conversation with growing amazement, probably wondering how a simple complaint about loitering teenagers had turned into an impromptu counseling session. But she could see what I was seeing. These weren't problem kids, they were kids with potential who needed guidance and opportunities. Over the next several weeks, I spent my off-duty time connecting those teenagers with resources. I found Maria a biology tutor through the church volunteer program. I connected Carlos with a mechanic who agreed to let him work part-time in exchange for learning the trade. I helped 3 of the kids sign up for GED programs at the community center. The complaints about teenagers causing problems in the park stopped, not because we had arrested anyone or issued citations, but because the kids now had better places to be and more productive things to do with their time. "Gonzalez," Captain Morrison said during my 6-month review, "your approach to community policing is unconventional, but your sector has seen a 30% decrease in repeat calls, and I'm getting positive feedback from business owners and residents about your work." "Thank you, Captain. I just try to remember that most problems have solutions if you take the time to understand what's really causing them. The department is considering expanding your role. Would you be interested in leading a community outreach program, training other officers in de-escalation and resource connection?" 6 months ago, I'd been a lonely widow sitting in an empty house, feeling useless and forgotten. Now I was being asked to share my skills with other officers to help shape how the LAPD approached community relations. "Captain, honey, I'd be honored." The community outreach program I developed combined traditional police training with the kind of human relation skills I'd learned from 40 decades of working with children and families. We trained officers to see past the immediate problem to the underlying causes, to connect people with resources instead of just issuing citations, to build relationships with community members instead of just responding to crises.
Officer Santos became one of my strongest advocates and closest friends, often telling new recruits about the day she learned that sometimes the best way to fight crime is to prevent the desperation that leads to criminal choices. The teenagers from Hollenbeck Park started calling me Abuela Beverly and would wave when they saw me on patrol, proud to tell their friends that they knew a real police officer who cared about their dreams. My children visited more often now, bringing my grandchildren to see Grandma the Cop and telling their friends about their badass mother who'd reinvented herself at 68. Tommy brought his law firm colleagues to meet me. Sarah featured my story in her company's newsletter about overcoming challenges. And Michael created a social media account documenting my adventures as the oldest rookie in LAPD history. But the moment that made everything worthwhile came almost exactly 1 year after I'd started this crazy journey. I was finishing my shift when I got called to a domestic disturbance on 6th Street, the same address where Officer Santos and I had met Roberto and Carmen on my first day. When I arrived, Roberto was outside the apartment building, but this time he wasn't angry or desperate. He was wearing a chef's uniform from the restaurant where he'd gotten that job interview, and he had the biggest smile I'd seen in years. "Officer Gonzalez," he called out when he saw me. "Thank you for coming, but there's no emergency. Carmen wanted to call you because we have good news to share." Carmen appeared with little Isabella now walking and babbling, and 2-year-old Carlos, who ran up to me like I was his grandmother. "Officer Beverly, look what Daddy brought." Roberto showed me an envelope, his first paycheck from a promotion to line supervisor at the restaurant. Carmen had finished her GED and started classes at the community college. They'd moved to a better apartment in a safer neighborhood, and they wanted to thank the police officer who'd seen them as people worth helping instead of problems to be managed. "Officer Gonzalez," tears streaming down her face, "you saved our family, not by arresting anyone or punishing anyone, but by showing us that there were people who cared about what happened to us." Y'all, standing there on that sidewalk in my police uniform, watching this young family celebrate their success, I understood that everything I've been through, Frank's death, my children's busy lives, my loneliness, my decision to completely reinvent myself at 68, had led me to exactly where I was supposed to be. I wasn't just a police officer. I was a bridge between law enforcement and the community, someone who understood that most people want the same things: safety for their families, opportunities for their children, and respect for their dignity. My age wasn't a disadvantage in police work. It was my greatest asset because I brought decades of experience understanding human nature, solving problems, and seeing potential in people others might write off. 2 years later, the Beverly Gonzalez Community Policing Program has been implemented in 6 LAPD divisions with plans to expand citywide. Officers trained in our approach report higher job satisfaction, better community relations, and fewer repeat calls in their sectors. The teenagers from Hollenbeck Park organized a scholarship fund for other kids who want to pursue education but can't afford it, and 3 of them have been accepted to 4-year colleges. Officer Santos was promoted to sergeant and now helps train new recruits in community policing techniques. Roberto and Carmen sent me a wedding invitation. They're getting married next month and want me to be their honorary abuela at the ceremony. My own grandchildren tell their friends that their grandmother is the coolest person they know, and my children call me more often now because they're genuinely interested in my life instead of just checking up on me out of duty. Every morning when I put on my uniform and pin on my badge, I think about that 68-year-old woman who walked into the LAPD station 2 years ago, determined to prove that age is just a number and experience is invaluable. The other officers don't see me as a curiosity anymore. They see me as a colleague who brings something unique and valuable to the job. But most importantly, sweetie, I see myself as someone who matters again, someone whose skills and experience make a difference in people's lives. I'm not just serving and protecting, I'm connecting and healing, building bridges between law enforcement and the communities we serve. Sometimes people ask me if I regret waiting so long to become a police officer, if I wish I'd started this career when I was younger. But honey, I couldn't have been the officer I am today without those 43 years in the school cafeteria, without raising 3 children, without navigating the challenges of being a wife and a mother and working woman. Every experience I've had, every skill I've developed, every relationship I've built has made me better at this job. Y'all, when that young punk tried to steal my purse on First Street, he had no idea he was about to launch the most rewarding career of my life. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best opportunities. And sometimes the things that make you different, like being a 68-year-old rookie, are exactly the things that make